A Bit Lit, celebrating creativity and research of all kinds.
Eleanor, it's so fantastic to see you again. I'm really looking forward to celebrating your new book. Congratulations, The Middle
Thank you very much.
Ages.
Book twins.
Hooray, book
Yay!
twins! The Middle Ages, a graphic history with Neil Max Emmanuel. Congratulations on the book, and for everyone watching, I strongly encourage them to look at it. And Eleanor, I'm sorry to start with something negative, but the thing that really surprised me about the book is it's called The Middle Ages. And, you know, I'd say that's maybe from the age of 40 to the age of 60 or 70. And actually, you spend very little time talking about those particular kinds of people. If anything, the images tend to depict people a little bit younger and a little bit older. So
I know.
If we start by just defining this term for us, what you mean by the Middle Ages?
So for the purposes of this book, when we say the Middle Ages, we're talking about the medieval period. And by that, we mean it's very Eurocentric, unfortunately. But by that, we mean from the quote unquote fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 to question mark, which the book spends a bunch of time dealing with how it's difficult to say exactly when the Middle Ages end. Generalized rule of thumb, if you're talking about the 16th century, you're probably talking about the early modern period and not the Middle Ages. But exactly what that means to everyone really depends from place to place.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And one of the amazing things about the book is it calls attention to and it questions the Eurocentricity. And I'd quite like to come back to that in a moment. And it's so good on probing away at when this period starts, when it ends, and what it means to call it a period, and when we started thinking of it as a period, and what it really does to define a period by saying, well, this is in the middle of more interesting things, which is kind of what the term seems to be doing. So I guess, you know, what we would call in our professional life historiography in the form of a graphic history was really exciting to see. I mean, my first question for you is, as someone whose expertise tends to fall on the eastern side of Europe, a lot of the Eurocentricity of this period tends to pull towards the west and perhaps to the south. And I wondered kind of how that felt for you writing. You know, your own research is so much more expansive and generous than the way we tend to think about medieval Europe, and yet sometimes the pull is still towards particular places and particular times.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one for me in particular, because, you know, as you've noted here, you know, my area of particular speciality is the Czech lands and Bohemia in particular. You know, shout out to Moravia. Sorry, guys. It's just, I work on Bohemia a little bit more. And that's interesting because for the, you know, from the kind of like, middle of the Middle Ages onwards, that's a part of the Holy Roman Empire, and it's very much a part of that milieu. And indeed, I work on when Czechs control the Holy Roman Empire. And a lot of the way that we think about the medieval period actually is kind of mediated through what the Italian peninsula thinks about the Middle Ages. So, you know, the ancient period, quote unquote, comes to an end when Rome falls. And I mean, what does that even mean? You know, which is a big thing that the comic grapples with, you know. So, we say that it's when Romulus Augustulus is deposed by Odoacer, and okay, fine. But at that point in time, you know, Romans were already ruling out of Ravenna. You know, the Roman Empire had already been split into two. The Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople goes on into, you know, the 15th century. So how do we know that Rome fell? You know, there are all these questions about it. And indeed, the idea that there is kind of like a new modern era is kind of ushered in again by Italian sensibilities in the, you know, Renaissance, moving on later. And that is generally a kind of infomercial in order to sell Italian art that is specifically about whinging about the fact that Italy no longer controls all of the known world. And so you know that things are bad because Italy isn't controlling it. And, you know, interestingly, what we tend to really buy this line from Italy. And, you know, my argument, which I make in the comic as well, is that our willingness to buy into Italy's line on this one is because when that was all happening, we were doing a big line in colonialism and imperialism. So we were like, oh yeah, things are really a lot better when you have big empires that are full of slaves. That's when stuff's nice and good, and you should like big empires full of slaves. That's just what's good. And you don't need to pay attention to any of the point in time, like where Czechs important at one point in time, just don't talk about that, you know? And so there's this kind of like willingness to overlook the Middle Ages in order to like absolve ourselves of the things that we're doing and to kind of like go along with this Italianate imperial, not empirical line of things. And I kind of try to get to the heart of that, but it is really interesting, you know, as someone who works in my line of history, because, you know, the entire medieval period for Czechs, the way they're very important, you know, the way that they are talked about by everyone. Like I was just reading about a Princess Anne of Bohemia who becomes Queen of England again the other day. And so she is the daughter of the Emperor Charles IV, and she gets married off to the English crown. And there's all this hand wringing at the Czech court, because in the first place, they had to go send a duke over there because they were like, where's England? Have you guys heard of this? No? Okay, look, we're gonna go check it out. And the guy goes like, they send like Duke Spithinev off or something like that. And he comes back and he's like, guys, it's a place. And everyone is like, you can't send a Czech girl there. Wait, like they only speak like 2 languages and one of them's English. That's not a language. And like everyone's just making fun of England, right? And so like that's what I study. And it's interesting because now we're just like, nah, none of that's relevant. It's all about, you know, England and Italy and France, and there were never any other countries. But I still have to work within that line because of how society works, I guess.
And also, I presume evidence, that the evidence for that early period in particular, we have so much more discourse coming at us from Italy and kind of places that were central to the Western Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the thing, too, is that one of the biggest issues that we have with the medieval period in general is source survival, just because it was rather a long time ago, to be fair. And, you know, so we do have better records and that sort of thing from places that were important in terms of the Roman Empire because they had more scribes. You know, they just were more geared towards that. And indeed, a lot of places like, so for example, again, the Czechs, they're not actually literate until into the early modern period, into the later early medieval period, however you want to define that, kind of like 7th century, 8th century. That's when we start getting literate. You know, Cyril and Methodius had to come up and have a chat with us. It was fine. But it is interesting because we also kind of like place obviously our own modern sensibilities on that. We're like, oh, well, something is bad if a society isn't literate, then it's bad, it's not good. And I mean, it's like, well, that's not true. But of course, it's very hard to study because if we don't know what people are thinking, that's the benefit of literacy, is that I can look at, you know, something that someone's written and say, oh, okay, well, this is what this guy thinks. And I can analyze that. If there isn't anything for me to look at, I cannot. And so that's the thing, is that the Italian city-states and everybody, they have really good records. The French have very good records. In Andalusia, we have great records, that sort of thing. So, you know, it all varies from place to place in terms of when is the uptake of literacy, when, you know, certain things like Christian norms, you know, when Christianity comes in, we tend to have better records because the church is really interested in keeping track of things. So you can kind of plot stuff a lot of the time by, you know, following Christianization, things like that over the period. I mean, I would argue Christianization is another one of the reasons why we're a little bit reticent about the medieval period as well, because our own kind of modern sensibilities, again, are like, oh, well, religion is bad, even though we're still extraordinarily religious. So, you know, we've got a real tension around that. But, you know, I am a big fan of Christianization because it allows me to have some records, which I love. I love some records.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I love the idea that the Middle Ages, its starting points and its finishing points are the product of Italian imperial infomercials. That's going to stay with me. And then right at the center of your book, you start asking about all the kinds of people that those sorts of imperial mindsets exclude, downplay, don't engage with at the time, and don't encourage us to engage with now. Do you want to tell us about that fantastic moment at the heart of the book?
Yeah, I really try to centralize the place of, you know, others in the Middle Ages. So, you know, the people that we don't often get to hear from, because the guys we get to hear from all the time are kings, nobles, and churchmen, right? And they are a lot of the time straight white guys with a lot of money. So I really wanted to make the point of that there are other people in the Middle Ages. You know, first of all, women. You may have heard of them. they're a little bit more than half of the population. And you could be forgiven a lot of the time if you look at kind of a lot of the history that's written about the medieval period for not realizing that women exist. Because, you know, medieval people kind of women as an afterthought. You know, they're very much in the Aristotelian mood of thought, and they sort of feel like, well, you've got your man, and then you've got a woman, and she's like an inside out man. She's kind of like, it's kind of like a man, but not, right? So it's like your default player is a man. So I spent some time kind of discussing why that is. And then I move on to other sections of society that are massively important but overlooked. So Jewish people, rather a lot of them about in the medieval period. And they're absolutely like integral, for example, to high finance, and indeed a lot of time forced to be involved in finance, which this covers. But, you know, without them, it's almost impossible to get a really good trading network going. I talk a lot about people with leprosy who are absolutely everywhere in the medieval period. Leprosy is endemic to medieval Europe, and it's a real problem. And people are really sort of grappling with what you do with people who have a disease that's really terrible and very frightening. And people don't want to catch it, so they're kind of unwilling to be around it, but everyone knows you need to help them. And this sort of space that people with leprosy inhabit as a result of that. And I tried to talk about gay people. Well, what we would call gay people, right? Because the thing is, in the medieval period, there's no such thing as being gay, just like there's no such thing as being straight. They don't have a conception of sexuality as such. For them, sexuality is kind of like a series of actions. So you can be a sodomite or not. But the thing is that, like, being a sodomite is like a very broad church, because a sodomite is just anyone who has non-procreative sex. So you could be a sodomite if you are having oral sex with your wife, right? As a man, so it was like, welcome to the club. You're in sodomy club. But of course, anyone that we would call gay is definitely a sodomite because, well, you know, cis gay, because they cannot engage in procreative sex. So they are therefore by default sodomites. And it's really interesting because there is a tendency, especially among, you know, homophobes and that sort of thing, now to say, oh, well, in the Middle Ages, because everyone was very religious, there's no such thing as gay people. And it's like, no, people are being pretty gay, you know. So we've got like love letters that, you know, nuns send back and forth to each other, or, you know, people who are like caught repeatedly having gay sex. And it's interesting. So, you know, like in Florence, for example, we'll say when sodomy laws are brought in at the end of the medieval period, because people just start getting a lot more head up about being gay at the end of the medieval period. You know, it's kind of like neither here nor there a lot of the other time. I mean, people don't like it, but there's no sodomy police, and literally the Italian city-states set up sodomy police at the end of the medieval period. But even if you get caught, it's sort of this thing where you get fined a couple lira the first time, then that doubles, then that triples, then that quadruples, and then I think it's like on the sixth time they are like, we are going to kill you, right? So obviously that's bad, because I'm against corporally punishing people for being gay. But it's also interesting because what we can see from things like that is that it's not necessarily the being gayness, it's the getting caught that they have a problem with, where they're like, tighten your shit up. I said, like, stop getting caught. And so it's more like this wanting to paint a veneer of respectability over society that we see. And along with that, part and parcel, another group of others that we talk about are sex workers, who are seen as absolutely necessary for the functioning of urban life in the medieval period. But again, they inhabit this really liminal space, because it's not necessarily good to be a sex worker, but it's also not the way that we think about it now. Like, we tend to think about sex work now as like, oh, it's this thing, and if you do it once, that defines your entire life, and you'll be absolutely, you know, damaged and rent asunder by the fact that you ever did sex work. Whereas for medieval people, it's like, well, we need to have sex workers. It's not great. Okay, so ideally, if you could go ahead and repent before you die and just go get married, great. Okay, then, you know, all bets are off. But of course, the flip side of that is if you don't repent before you die, then you die out of communion with the church. At the same time, individuals within the church are making a great deal of money off of sex work. So, you know, there's a big question mark about who gets to be respectable there. And surprise, surprise, it's well-connected rich men. But the point is that, you know, when we tend to say the medieval period, everyone just thinks, right, knights on horses, maybe there's a monk there. There's kings and princesses, and maybe there's a Viking. But there's this whole these whole huge groups of people that are there, immensely important and very interesting. And I think it behooves us all to just kind of have a think about all the different types of people who exist in the medieval period.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you. That's really great. And you use the phrase there, you could be a sodomite, and it's that sort of aspirational pep talk content that we absolutely want on our website. So thank you. Thank you for that. I'd love to talk to you about the challenge of writing this book, because the challenge of selection and compression and saying things in incredibly tight spaces often must have been immense, but it also means that you bring together things in a really fruitful way. And one of the things I loved is the focus on, I hope I'm going to say this word rightly now, phallosocracies, which sounds like, a whole society is built around the phallus, which I presume is not what it is. But this, we often think about the Roman Empire, we talk about their roads. You just mentioned knights on horses. Holy Roman Empire is such an important power in this period, and we think of this great landmass. But actually, this is true of the Roman Empire as well. But you call our attention to places like Venice and Genoa, and also the Vikings, whose power is built on sea and ships. I wondered if you could talk us a little bit about that section of the book.
Yeah, it's really quite an interesting one, I think, because actually it's people who have great shipping lines that are in many ways the best off in the medieval period. And that's just a fact. When we think about the power of Venice or the power of Genoa, it's completely down to their absolute domination of shipping lines in the medieval period. So, this is how you end up with Venetian colonies in Croatia and on the Greek islands, and, out on, even in Constantinople. One of the big ways that the Black Death comes in to Europe is through Genoese salt traders, because they were out on the Crimean Peninsula when it happened to get sacked by some Mongols who had the plague, and this is how things move through Europe. So it's interesting because the city-states there, that they've got a landmass, but actually every single thing about them that makes them powerful, that makes them extraordinarily well off, has to do with how they can move. And it's an interesting thing because people often talk about the world being a bigger place in the medieval period, which it certainly was. And, we estimate that most things can only move about 30 miles a day. And that's kind of like what's in striking distance for either you're a really good walker and you don't get tired, or you've got a horse. But ships move very, very quickly, actually. And so we know that if you really want to move things around, you can do it by ship extremely quickly. And so, for example, the Vikings, they end up moving all over. We've got evidence that the Vikings were in Baghdad at a point in time, and they are working at the court in Constantinople. They're shipping things back and forth. They're shipping furs from the north, occasionally polar bears, which is apparently a really big royal flex, is to get a hold of a polar bear and be like, polar bear, got a polar bear, and the Vikings will bring you a polar bear for the right price, and that sort of thing. So it's quite interesting because we do tend to think about the Middle Ages as being this quite land-bound thing. Yeah. But the way to be actually very rich and important and well-connected and to have a lot of prestige comes down to, do you have a boat, actually? And this will end up having huge repercussions for things like pilgrimage, or it has a lot of repercussions for going on crusade. So the Venetians really control whether or not, you can go to Jerusalem later on, and that sort of thing. And it also is really quite interesting because it is very Roman in a way, in that, the thing about the Roman Empire really is control of the Mediterranean. Sure, they have outposts like up here in Britannia, but that isn't what is important about their empire. What's important about their empire is that, you've got an amphora that came from Tunis. That's the thing. And there are plenty of city-states who are willing to do that for you in the medieval period. So, I think that one of logistics is an overlooked and really important thing in the medieval period, because that's how you get all of the good and interesting things. Like, that's how you get your spices in from Indonesia, which we know people were doing. There's someone is coming on a boat from Indonesia to the Middle East, and then it's moving across, and God bless them, because everybody likes nutmeg, really. So.
My husband does not like nutmeg, but let's park that. Let's park that counter evidence briefly. It's interesting hearing you talk about the Rome's relationship with the Mediterranean, because they give it that name, don't they? And I presume the Medi in Mediterranean is the same as the Medi in medieval. They're both different kinds of middles omitting that weird thing of both centering and then, certainly in the case of the medieval, sort of getting rid of and saying, well, this is the intervening bit, the interval. And you talked too about the kind of legacy of what places like Venice are doing. But I guess another legacy is what happens towards the end of the period with colonization. That is also all about shipping, logistics, keeping control of the sea, who has boats, who is able to get around. That's another example of that. So it's a comic history, and a graphic history. And right at the end of the book, you acknowledge Meg John Barker, who was in my head too as I was reading the book, thinking, I wonder what the relationship here is in terms of whether there was a model or someone, a potential kind of way of doing this kind of thing. But do you mind telling us about the sheer kind of the praxis, the challenge of putting history into relatively short pieces of text accompanying very particular images and across the space of a book? Can we hear a bit more about what that was like?
Yeah, so I owe a great debt to Meg John Barker, who is a good friend of mine, because in the first place, I was made aware that one could do this because of their queer graphic history. And I thought it was a really great medium. I've always loved comics. If you could see my bookshelves, they are basically just a bunch of comics, but that's fine. So, that was something that was really appealing to me. So when I started thinking about this, I went to them first and I said, do you think that this is something that has legs, and how did you do it? And they kind of showed me their method. And so what they did, and what I then copied because I thought it was really good and useful, is, so it's a very short number of words per page. It's 140 words per page. Wow. Which is not much. And so what I would do is I would write what the 140 words were. And then in another font color, I would then say any words that I wanted in speech bubbles for what the picture would be that I had in my mind. And then I would describe what the picture was that I had in my mind. And often I think you can really tell, Neil's done a really great job on the illustrations here. I would go find medieval images and say, okay, well, this is what I had in mind. Here is an actual image of this. And he would then adapt those. So that was kind of the process, and kind of like thinking in that way and putting everything down on one page and then moving to another is how I did it. I had an outline first, obviously. And I'm a huge believer in outlines, just a really big one. But it's one thing saying I'm going to cover all these things and then realizing that you have a very few number of words. And then fun fact, right before I was due to turn it in, I was like, yes, here we go. I'm bagging on time. I'm ready to turn this into my editor. I will just have a quick edit before I send it over to Kira. And then I got back to the beginning and I was like, these pages seem like they're really short on the word limit. What's going on here with this? And I came to realize that at some point in the book, I'd say about a third of the way through, I convinced myself that it was 280 words per page. So I had actually written twice as much for the great majority of it. And then I had to go through and cut half out, which, I thought 280 words was not much to get all of these points across, but it will help you sharpen things up when you know that you have written too much. So that was an interesting process as well, because it was sort of looking at it and going, no, literally, what half of this can go? So it was, I wouldn't recommend that people write a book in this manner. But on the other hand, you can kind of say, all right, well, if half of this has to go, well, what are the absolute bare bone essentials that I want people to understand? And I think that's also really useful for a general audience because, obviously, as someone who's trained as an academic, I can waffle. I got 100,000 words for you. Don't worry about it. But not everybody wants 100,000 words, right? The entire point of this is that it's entry level. It knocks every single little nail you kind of need in place to get a broad idea of what the Middle Ages is. And then you can pick a thing that you're interested in and go on and read from there. So that was good, but also very stressful at the time. I think the way that I structured the timeline, though, initially was I looked at my syllabus for first-year courses. And I was like, so what are like the major threads that I want people to pick up through? And so it's kind of like Roman inheritance, monasticism, the concept of the other, the imperial papal rivalry, Vikings, the rise of cities, all these things. So it follows a chronological order, but kind of loops back through, the rise of Islam we cover. I want to make sure that everyone has a good idea of what happened and in what order, but you can't be too slavish with the details because everyone's just trying to figure out what medieval means. I can't really start going into like the production product of manuscripts. It's not the time. It's not the time.
That's great. And that's a really lovely insight into how it worked. Did you have conversations too about kind of the design of the page? So if you're saying I'd like a certain illustration, did you also get to talk about where on the page that might fall? I'm looking at page 46 where the Vikings are literally, they are traveling between your two paragraphs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Neil and I worked really closely on this. So basically, it's a real shame because a lot of it got done by Zoom. We started pre-pandemic and we were kind of like hanging out in like the Tate members room and having a coffee and, chatting. And that was a lot more fun. And then later on, it all moved to Zoom. So we would just kind of go through them and he would ask me questions about what it was the notes that I put through. And we would talk about that. Yeah. So we would say, he had some really brilliant ideas. Like that one of the river flowing through the paragraphs, that's all Neil. There is also, I think earlier on in the beginning, there is a thing about when we're talking about how various cultures kind of weave together. Here it is on page 9. So the Germans, Moors, and Greeks, and this everybody kind of like stitching into a part of a tapestry was his idea, which I really enjoyed. I did try to think a lot of the time, if it's broken up and there's a picture in between, that's something I put in because I'd realized that either I changed topics or there was something that I was explicitly trying to give a picture to. And then sometimes it was just like, we're doing the same thing over and over again. We really need to break this up, so that also had an impact in terms of, we just didn't want people to get too visually bored. Yeah. So sometimes it is a genuine kind of artistic choice on the part of Neil. Sometimes it is me trying to underline a particular concept. And sometimes it's us just being like, oh, we've been doing the same thing for a little too long. Break it up.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you. And then Ellen, I think my last question, you've both done such a terrific job with this. So it's really exciting to hear about how that worked. I guess the other big challenge for you is that you're introducing and describing a topic which the majority of people will have fairly hazy understanding of, but at the same time will also bring with them all kinds of assumptions about what it means to describe something as medieval. This is very medieval, etc. So you in the book you find yourself constantly saying things and denying things, which I think that's how Eddie Izzard says you should sing the American national anthem.
Yeah, so the lyrics. Confirming and denying.
Yeah. That's kind of a dialogic state you find yourself in a lot of the time. And can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so I actually introduced it when I first wrote this. I kind of had introduced the entire way through a kind of antagonistic character who was questioning things and putting forward ideas. And he's still there at the beginning of the book to frame things. And my editor Kira said, "Look, I took him out a lot of the time because I hate that guy." And I was like, well, yeah, me too, girl. That's kind of the point. And I'm dealing with that guy constantly. And it's really interesting because the thing about the medieval period is that people don't really know that much about it. It's simply not taught in schools. It's not considered to be a kind of bedrock part of the quote unquote history that we're taught, because the majority of history that we're taught, again, is largely nationalistic in character. If you aren't a massively important place in the medieval period, it might not care that much about teaching medieval history, things of that nature. And also it's just really complicated. And what does that even mean? And it really varies place to place. So it's a very difficult thing to do. But as a result, people also really feel like they've got the medieval period, right? It's very much one of those confidence things. So they don't need to know about the medieval period because everything they know about the medieval period is it was bad. The church was hiding under your bed like some kind of church cop and was going to jump out and stop you from doing science, which apparently the Romans had. The Romans had science. The church suppressed it. Nobody bathed. 1066 ? And then the Renaissance. And like, that's what people know. And interestingly, people are really wedded to that narrative, even though, you know, it's not actually something that bears any semblance of reality to what's on the ground. They're a little bit poisoned by Voltaire. A lot of things are Voltaire's fault. You know, Voltaire is the one who got really mad about the medieval period and the church and calls it bad. And a lot of our thinking is based on that. But you do kind of have people who will become quite reactionary. You know, I'll have people who have not studied, they've not read a book on the medieval period in their life, and they will argue up and down with me on Twitter about the field of study that I have dedicated my entire life to. You know, they don't speak a word of Latin, but they are absolutely certain that medieval people didn't bathe and the church cops were burning witches. And to a certain extent, it doesn't matter what you say to them because it's almost like a belief. It's an origin story. So, you know, what I want to do with this is make it clear that, you know, the medieval period can be really accessible. It's just that people haven't done that yet, really. So we all have the ability to learn a little bit more about this, but we can't do it until people put the things out there that are public facing and easy. You know, I think one of the big problems that we face with countering this narrative is that people find it daunting as well. You know, no one necessarily wants a huge tome that's going to really get into Latin transliterations and, you know, thinking about Bede. You know, of course, I love to think about Bede. Everybody likes to think about Bede if you're a medieval historian, but the average person on the street doesn't care. What they want you to do is tell them, well, literally what's a narrative here? Like, how do I know what happened in the medieval period? And so I'm trying to not fight with these people who, you know, spoil my every waking moment, but also that guy is at the very beginning of the book. But I try to like to cast audiences in opposition to him because I'm like, you're not that guy. You're coming with me, right? And that's what it's all about, right? It's like bringing people in and letting them be on the team that's got some kind of understanding of the medieval period. You know, I'm very much against the kind of insular idea of history, is that it's something that is done by academics behind closed doors. You know, I think that history is for everybody. It's just that it hasn't always been portrayed that way.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think when you write origin stories in 1066, it's also that part of the kind of weddedness to those earlier narratives is that if you just count the Middle Ages, then suddenly you get to start telling stories about your own national identity from a moment of state formation, whether that be Spain or Germany or something that looks a bit like Britain happening towards the end of the period. Yeah, so good luck with that guy. I hope, although you don't want to read us to be that guy, I hope he comes round. I love the fact his first image is him doing this and saying, well, this noise is doink doink. You can have a noise for that. Eleanor, congratulations. It's a fantastic book. I'm really thrilled to have got to hear more about your thinking behind it, the process of it, and I will certainly be thinking about the infomercial, yeah, I can't say the word, infomercials of the Italian imperial kind when I think about the Middle Ages. I still don't feel like you've told me anything about being 40 to 60, but, you know, I will soldier on.
I'm still working on that, okay? You know, give me a couple of years and I'll report back.
Maybe that's your sequel. Thank you ever so much.
Thanks so much, Andy. It's a pleasure as always.